Hey everyone, thank you for joining me. So today I will be customizing the Blade HQ Brass CEO from CRKT. Now I've done a few of these in the past, and I'll leave a link up somewhere here in the corner where I create the brass scales themselves, since at that time CRKT wasn't doing any brass scales. So now I'll be adding some rock pattern texture to both of these scales, and it'll just be a really quick mod. So a really quick shout out to Nick for sending this in to getting some texture done to it. So let's take this thing apart and see what the scales look like on the inside. Alright, so here they are, taken off, and they look pretty similar to mine, other than the way they did the holes here, and then the recessed little section here for the liner lock. So pretty simple, and that's pretty much it. So let's get to putting some texture on these scales. Alright, so now that we're down here in the shop, we can get started on putting the rock texture onto these scales. Now before I get into it, I just want to say that this is going to be a brief video on how I create the rock pattern texture on scales. Now I'll be doing a more in-depth video on G10, which I highly recommend. It's a lot easier to practice on, and it's a lot more forgiving than let's say brass or any material that's harder than G10. So basically where I like to start on the rock pattern texture is the highest point of the scale. So since these are contoured, I'm basically going to start on the center of the scale. Once I get that established, I'll show you kind of how I read the layout of the rock pattern texture, since this will be a random rock pattern texture. It won't be uniform. And one thing to look out for when you are doing the rock pattern texture is make sure where your pocket clip is. Since this one's already laid out for me, you can see the flat spot for the pocket clip. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to put rock pattern texture or whatever texture you're putting on the scale. You don't want to mess up that flat spot, because if you do, then obviously the pocket clip won't work anymore. It just won't sit nicely. So if you don't have a flat spot like this, typically what I do is I'll install the pocket clip, then I'll take a permanent ink marker and mark my landing area for the pocket clip, and then that lets me know to avoid putting texture around the pocket clip area. So really quick, let me show you what I use. I use the Dremel here. I have a 2-speed Dremel, low and high. I highly recommend a 2-speed just because there are some projects where I need a lower speed. But anyways, you do have sanding pads. I have the medium size on it right now, since I will be doing a smaller random rock pattern texture. But you do have a small, so you can see here. So there's the small, so the medium, and then you have the large. I typically use the large just because it makes a wider and bigger pattern. But since these scales are so small, I'm going to be using the medium size, getting a nicer, smaller rock pattern texture. So that's what I'll be using on these ones. And also I'm using the 320 grit. So you guys can see here. I usually stick between 300 and 600. So as long as you're in between there, you should be fine, since the lower the grit that you choose puts a certain type of grain, gives you either more grain in the pattern that you're digging out or less grain. So obviously the higher the grit on the sand disc that you're using, a finer grain in the pattern texture. So it just depends on what you like. Again, I'm going to go with the 320 because I think it gives it just the right balance of that little fine grain in the texture itself. But like I said, I'm going to get started on it, and I'll probably go halfway. I'll start at the bottom. I'll go halfway, and then I'll explain from there kind of what I'm doing. Also, I like to use a glove before I start. It just keeps the dust off my hand. And I typically have a fan blowing on high just to push the dust from out of my face. I usually wear a mask too, just to keep the dust from going in my lungs. But obviously I'm speaking to you guys right now, so I'll let it slide this time. And sorry about the noise, I got the fan going and then the refrigerator in the garage. But like I said, we're going to start in the center of the scale and we'll go from there. Alright, so I got my random pattern texture started, and this does tend to get pretty warm. Obviously if you're continuously going, it's going to get pretty hot. So I like to keep some water next to me in a jar, and I just dip it in there to cool it off. But so you guys can see here, I started, and again it's random. It's a random texture, so I'm just kind of putting it where I please. But as you guys can see right here, you have these sharp points, and typically whenever I do the texture, not typically, always, whenever I put the texture in there, I like to make them meet up, or at least touching somewhere. That way this gives you these sharp points, as you can see here. So I have them everywhere, and I'm using these as guides for the next step. So once I have the center section all randomly textured, then I will use these sharp points as guides. So I'll go, again it's contoured, so it's a slight angle. So I'll go, after I get the center done, I'll go from a slight angle that goes and meets up into this sharp point, which will eliminate that sharp point and then create another texture that just blends in with the rest of these. So I'm going to finish the center here and work my way around the flat spot for the pocket clip, and then I'll explain about these high points after that. Alright, so I got the centered all done up, and this is a little toasty right now, but I think we'll be alright. So as you guys can see, I got the center all finished. I avoided touching that flat spot. I did go a little bit ahead of it, finish that off a little bit. But there is the first step, I guess. And then what we're going to do is, like I said, these sharp points right here are going to be your guides. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to feed into them, and then I'm going to keep a watchful eye on where my angle, or how my angle is set on the Dremel. And then I'm just going to lightly touch it before I fully commit and put a deep groove into the section of where I'm putting that next basically groove for the pattern. So I'm going to do that really quick and just show you. So I'll do this one right here. Let's start at this one right there. So what we're going to do is go into this high point, and then I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so there is that. So I'm going to show you what I did. So we got right here, this spot. So as you guys remember, there was a similar area just like this one here, that high point. And now we put a nice groove into it. And again, it just eliminates that smooth, clean spot, or that sharp point. And then it slowly pushes us towards the edge, which once you get to the edge, then you're finished. But I'm going to do this in between all these high points, or sharp points, and then I will go from there. Alright, so there are the outer edges from the center. Just clean it up, and it's getting really warm now, but still handle it. But here is the result so far. And then as you can see, when you start from the center and then push your way out, you get those high points, or I just like to call them guides, because this basically guides you where you want to go. But the further you go out, the smaller these areas get, and then you just keep adding certain grooves in those high points. As you can see, this is the, like I said before, it's the random rock pattern texture, so it's kind of all over the place, which is one of my favorites because you don't have to stay too uniform. But keep in mind, when you are going to these high points, you don't have to go straight into them. You can go at a slight angle like this one, Some go straight, some don't. Again, this is random. So I highly recommend this pattern texture first, especially on G10, just to get a feel for it and an understanding of the tool. And obviously more practice you have with this, the easier it gets. I can promise you that, because I was in the same boat. I had no idea what I was doing, but practice is definitely key. And another thing I just wanted to show you, you guys can see the grain in the texture, so that's what I was talking about earlier. And what's cool about going at different angles is when the light hits it, it shifts and dances, which is really, really cool on this texture. Plus, brass is just awesome, and it does that effect. Same with copper. But there it is. Let me finish this whole scale off, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so I'm finished basically with the whole scale, and as you guys can see, it looks pretty darn good. And again, those guides will push you out towards the edge, and then what I like to do on the edge is pick certain areas where to go at a higher angle. Let's see if I can find a spot. So we got one, here we go. So we got one right here. As you guys can see, it's a very, very sharp angle, and it just creates a really, really cool look. And as you guys can see, when you move it around in the light, it does its thing. Again, this is one of the reasons why I really like this texture, mainly on brass and copper. It just has a really, really cool effect. So I kept the area for the pocket clip pretty flat. I touched up the edges a little bit, but it's not going to do any harm to the pocket clip. But I made sure to at least leave a flat spot. And then towards the end, where the bottom back spacer is on this knife, I made sure to keep the design or the texture not... I avoided going too deep, basically, so that when you run your finger across, you don't feel that dip in between the scale and then the back spacer. So just keep that in mind. And always double check your work before you commit, just to make sure you're not getting rid of important spots. And then I made sure to keep the area where the pocket clip is actually touching, so where the tension part is, to keep it pretty high. That way you still have tension on the scale. And that's pretty much it. So what I'm going to do is finish off the other scale. Pretty much do the exact same thing, start in the center, work my way out. One more quick thing I forgot to mention was after I'm finished with the rock pattern texture, just in case there's any sharp points or high points, I like to hit it with 1000 grit, just very, very lightly. And again, that creates a pretty cool texture on top of the texture itself, and then again eliminates those sharp or high points. Alright, so we're back up here in the studio and the scales are finished. Now I'm going to try to avoid touching these too much since I don't want to tarnish the brass. But there it is, all said and done. And I lightly hit all the corners and the high spots on the texture. So it's nice and comfortable now. You don't have to worry about getting cut or getting poked too hard. But there it is. Again, I could just look at this stuff all day, and who knows, maybe I can make some jewelry that I can wear. But anyways, finished. So I'm going to wear gloves while assembling this knife. Again, just not to tarnish the brass. So let's get to putting this thing together. Alright, so here it is all put together. I think it turned out really, really good. I think the customer's really going to enjoy it. And I gotta say, this was a big time saver to not actually create the scales, which is a plus. And it's still enjoyable to create this texture. I I don't think I'll ever get sick of it. I'm definitely going to do more titanium knives with this style and then anodize it. Those videos will be coming up soon, so look out for those videos. And let me know what you guys think down below if you guys like these style videos. And just a heads up, I will be doing a more in-depth how to create not only this rock texture but just different kinds of textures with just a Dremel. So look out for those videos as well. Appreciate you guys watching. Thank you very much for the support, and I will see you guys on the next one.